Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. The Iowa History 101 webinar series, which focuses on the past lives of Iowans, continues on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will learn about the 1980s farm crisis and its impact on the families and communities of Iowa, as well as how a decade of stress challenged everyone involved in the business of agriculture. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Pamela Riney-Kerberg. Pam is the Distinguished Professor of History at Iowa State University, where she has taught since 2000. She is the author of a number of books, including Rooted in Dust, Surviving Drought and Depression in Southwestern Kansas, and Childhood on the Farm, Work, Play, and Coming of Age in the Midwest. She is a fellow of the Agricultural History Society. Currently, she is completing a book on Iowa and the farm crisis of the 1980s. And I'm very happy to turn over to Pam to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm glad that you are here this afternoon. Thanks to the State Historical Society for inviting me to participate in Iowa History 101. Today, I am looking forward to talking to you about my book project, When a Dream Dies, Agriculture, Iowa, and the Farm Crisis of the 1980s. This is going to be a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk about the causes of the farm crisis, its consequences for Iowans, the ways in which Iowans responded, and finally, the long-term effects of the farm crisis. But let's just begin with setting the stage, which is, well, when you set the stage for the discussion of the farm crisis, you do have to start before the 1980s. I could push my discussion all the way back to 1900, when farmers in the United States began to be able to produce more than the citizens of the country could eat. But today I'm going to start with the 1970s, or as agricultural economists called them, the go-go 70s. In those years, you had very high inflation, but a very low cost of borrowing. The costs of business were going up and up and up for farmers. Prices for crops first went up and then they went down. Farmers were selling grain to the Soviet Union for the first time in a very long time, and that opened up some new markets, but that was not enough to keep prices up throughout the decade. Probably the most important issue to note is that land values were soaring during the 1970s. The economic situation in those years was such that the cost of borrowing was very low. And because of those soaring land values, farmers had a great deal of collateral for loans. This set of conditions was also paired with an attitude of the go-go 70s. It was during this decade that agriculture throughout the United States experienced a set of conditions that really promoted expansion. Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz encouraged farmers to plant from fence row to fence row and to get big or get out. Many young farmers who were college educated also wanted to improve their operations. They wanted to add new technology. They wanted to increase the size of their farms. And interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that land prices were high and going higher, people were buying more of it. They would say things like, well, they're not going to be making any more of it, so we ought to buy land now. By the end of the 1970s, levels of debt throughout Iowa were incredibly high. They were as high as they had been between 1915 and 1919, when farmers had borrowed a great deal of money to take advantage of the high crop prices of World War I. The result of that borrowing was disaster. And unfortunately, the result of borrowing in the 1970s also ended up being disaster. People certainly didn't know that that situation was just around the corner. They had borrowed money on the basis of a set of conditions that existed in the 70s. And all of a sudden, things were going to be less optimistic than they had hoped for. If the conditions of the 1970s had remained, farmers might have struggled by, but conditions were going to change, and they were going to change radically. There were numerous causes of the farm crisis of the 1980s. Here are a number of those causes. Debt was extremely high. The cost of inputs was high. There were also falling prices for corn and hogs and soybeans and cattle. But the kicker was interest rates. In 1979, Paul Volcker had become chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he became chairman promising to get inflation under control. And the means that he chose to get inflation under control was by raising interest rates to incredibly high numbers. Interest rates went as high as 24% in the early part of the 1980s. For farmers, this was disastrous. It was disastrous for a number of reasons, but in particular because it caused the price of land to fall, and to fall precipitously. Explaining this is a little bit complicated, but think of it this way. Land generally had a rate of return of 3 to 4%, which during the 1970s had been attractive to investors when interest rates were low. But when interest rates rose as high as 24%, this made land an unattractive investment. A certificate of deposit, a checking account, even a savings account had a higher rate of interest, a higher rate of return than land did. Land values fell and kept on falling. By 1986, farmland all across Iowa had lost at least 60% of its value. The loss per county ranged somewhere between 60 and 67%. It was an across the board disaster when it came to the value of farmland. This made farmers vulnerable to foreclosure and to forced sales. Their assets, once the price of farmland fell, were now worth far less than their debts. And this was a terrible moment for large numbers of Iowa farmers. Who was affected? Well, about a third of Iowa farmers were in imminent danger of losing their farms. They were in such dire straits that disaster was right around the corner. Another third were struggling, but they were expected to make it through somehow. It was only that last third that was in good economic shape. These were established farmers without significant debt. They were generally older, and they were committed to the idea of making do and doing without. They were using the same tractors that they'd been using since the 50s. They were not adding significantly to the amount of land that they had. They weren't adding significantly to structures on their farms. So there's this small group, there's this third that are doing fine, but 2/3 of farmers were in really difficult condition. Now, the question is, how did they find themselves in trouble? Some of these were farmers who regularly borrowed to maintain their business, people who fed cattle or fed hogs. These people would also be smacked hard later in the 1980s by a government program called PIC, or Payment in Kind, that happened in 1983, which paid farmers in kind with corn and soybeans not to grow. Livestock farmers on the whole opted out of that program because they wanted to ensure that their animals got high quality grain. And then they got hit by a drought late in 1983. So livestock raisers were facing even more problems. It wasn't just that their debts were significant, it was also because government programs were working against them a bit as well. Some of the other farmers who were in trouble were young and just getting started. They ended up in a really precarious position. It was a time in life when farmers were likely to have debts, and those debts were simply unaffordable, particularly in the early 1980s. Some were young and ambitious. They borrowed against the value of their land and they made improvements. A lot of them were college educated. A lot of them wanted to try out the newest and best ideas, and that ended up causing them trouble. And then there were the older farmers. And you know, all of this is terribly sad, but the one that really strikes me often is thinking about the older farmers who borrowed against the value of their land to bring their children and their grandchildren into their operations. They were planning for the future. They were taking advice. They were doing what everybody told them to do. And that ended up sometimes destroying century farms, farms that had been in families for 100 years or more. They were hoping for the future and ended up losing everything as a result. This cartoon tells us what the situation looked like by 1986. It was a crisis that lasted from roughly 1979 to roughly 1993. I cut off my story at the floods of 93. But it was at its worst in 1984, 1985, and 1986. And as this little cartoon tells you, things must have felt terribly desperate for large numbers of families. But we can know a little bit more about what it was like to live through this decade. I decided to go to the source, which was the letters that people wrote to their elected officials, in this case, Governors Robert Ray and Terry Branstad. I'm going to be talking to you today about a small sample of the letters that people wrote to their governors before I move on to a more general discussion of how all of this shook out in the end. But I think it's really important to look at these letters because they're heartbreaking, they're intimate, they're very personal statements about what this decade felt like. What it felt like to lose a farm, what it felt like to suffer through year after year, not knowing what was going to happen next. And there are thousands of these letters in the State Historical Society. I have a picture here of one of the boxes that was completely unorganized. Most of the boxes are a little better organized than this, but there are thousands of these letters that can tell us what people were thinking as they wondered if their farm was going to be there in the next year. Now, a number of the letters came from men, but there seemed to be fewer than there were from women. And also many of the letters that came from couples appear actually to have been written by and signed by the women in the family. But men's letters were often shorter, often somewhat less descriptive. They may not have been as comfortable with asking for help as women were. They may have been more ashamed of their situation than some of the women were. Keep in mind that losing a farm was a deeply shameful experience for most of the people who went through it. Farmers thought of their land as something with which their parents and their grandparents had entrusted them, and they were supposed to hand it down intact to children and grandchildren. And so losing a farm was often like losing a member of the family, deeply embarrassing, deeply shameful, and very, very hard on the people who experienced this. Here we have a short letter from a farm man written on the back of a card when Branstad was governor and they were facing re-election bids. Cards would be sent out to members of the Iowa Republican Party to ask for donations. And there are a fair number of letters that came in that were written on the back of these donation cards, explaining why someone wasn't giving money this year. And this one said, "I've always contributed to Terry's elections, but this year is different. We are farmers and we just don't have money to do so. There are many farmers in our neighborhood going broke." And so this is his explanation of why he can't do something he would normally do, and his explanation of what was happening in his household. You know, some of the letters from men really were quite impassioned, but I would say in general, not quite so much as the letters that you see from men, or excuse me, from women. There were also a large number of letters from children that were included in this collection. Often you could tell that they were written as a part of assignments in a class. A lot of children were told to write a letter to the governor as a part of a class assignment, or high school students were supposed to do this as a part of their civics lessons. But they too often wrote very interesting letters to the governor about what was bothering them. And many farm boys in particular referred to the farm as a part of a future they wanted to inherit. And they were asking the governor for help to make sure that they would be able to inherit the farm. This boy writes, "We need some new farm equipment and the prices are too high now." And he's asking the governor for help. Here we have a letter from a girl, and I love this one because it's done in 4 different colors, and it's signed with a heart. And she's letting the governor know what she cares about. She says, "Why are the farms in Iowa so poor? Is there something we can do about it? I hope there is." If you read more in the letter, I think it's possible that she was more concerned about the state of girls basketball at her school. But nonetheless, she's concerned about farmers, and she wants to be sure that the farmers are going to be taken care of. I really love this letter. This is one of the most passionate letters I saw by a teenager, a 14-year-old Iowa farm boy, who is demanding that something be done. He demanded lower prices for farm equipment, lower interest rates, and he was deeply critical of President Reagan. He said that President Reagan was all talk and no go. And it's interesting, in a large number of the kids' letters, but also when parents wrote about how their children were responding to the farm crisis, there are a fair number of them that were concerned that the president didn't care about farmers and didn't care about their situation. And that thread runs through a number of the letters. In particular, they would be upset when the president would authorize some sort of aid payment to a country overseas at the same time as farmers were asking for help and not getting it. So, here we have this young man demanding that something be done, and with lots of underlining, exclamation points, and some capital letters, because he wanted to make sure that the governor understood just how much he was concerned about this. As I've already mentioned, the largest number of letters were from women. They were passionate. They provided detailed discussions of conditions on their farms and how their family had ended up in the situation they were in. It was usually also accompanied by a detailed description about how they economized. There were a number of people who accused farmers of having been reckless in their spending in the 1970s, and that farmers who were going out of business were doing so because they were reckless. And these farm women wanted to show that they weren't, that in fact they were economizing, that they were being careful. And the purpose of these letters was multi-part. It was to ask for help, but it was also to reassure themselves that they had done everything that they could to try and save their farms. Women's role very much was to be a caretaker for their families. And in that role as caretakers, they had to ask for help. But they also seemed much more comfortable than the men in discussing very intimate matters like debt, like mental health, like the ways in which they were experiencing poverty. And they felt like they really did have to ask for help. And in this letter, the woman explains that she and her husband had chosen farming as a vocation, that they wanted to continue, but if they were going to continue, they needed help now. That for farmers, there was no unemployment. They had to be able to keep going somehow. A number of these letters are what I call 4 o'clock in the morning letters. I'm assuming a lot of them were written at the kitchen table in the very early hours of the morning when someone couldn't sleep, in a last-ditch effort to get some sort of aid. This couple was about to file bankruptcy. They were desperate. They had purchased their farm in 1977, and they were about to lose it. And there's a lot of heartbreak in this letter. The woman writes, "Wouldn't we be better off on welfare?" She also writes, "The other day, our son said, 'Please bring some McDonald's sandwiches for supper.' Little did he know that we took money from his bank. If we have to take money from our children, who will we be taking it from next?" You can tell just how deep her despair was, and that she felt that they had really sunk practically as low as they could go because they were taking money from their children to buy dinner. Many people didn't even know where to start in asking for help. This is a letter from a couple. Because it's typed and because of the signature, I tend to think it was probably, in fact, written by the woman in the family. And it was written in the aftermath of the 1985 Farm Aid Concert. Was that farm aid money did not go to bail out individual farms, to pay off individual farmers' debts. Instead, that money was used for food aid. It was used to pay for legal aid. The money went to social service agencies. But this couple didn't know that, and they're writing in saying, how do we apply for farm aid money? We won't file for bankruptcy. What can we do to save ourselves? I wanted to show you this letter because it's page 5 of one of those 4 o'clock in the morning letters. And you'll notice that the handwriting has gotten very big. There are a lot of pleases, a lot of help, help, helps. It's a measure of just what a burden this person was feeling at 4 o'clock in the morning when they were asking for help. And another one of those letters. I think this writer did a wonderful job of explaining how the death of a farm was like a death in the family. She says, I've went through the sleepless nights, the cold sweats. I'm not sure, but that I'm not to the anger stage. What is next? It's like the 5 stages after experiencing death from a member of one's family or from a close friend. The stages are all the same. Now, not all of the letters were from farmers. Some were from business owners who are watching what the crisis was doing to their communities, to their businesses. And in fact, there were letter writing campaigns on the part of some communities. And you'd have letters from business owners, from doctors, from dentists, from lawyers, from bankers, with everybody explaining how the crisis was affecting their community. And here we have a woman from Inwood, Iowa, who owned a fabric store, who said that she was terribly concerned about what the farm crisis was going to do to the towns. So go the farmers, so go the towns. And I think this illustrates a really important point about the farm crisis, and that is that everyone had something to lose. A third of Iowa's farmers were highly unlikely to lose their farms, but because of population losses, because of farm losses, small towns were losing population at an incredible rate. And when the small towns were losing population, the community might lose its school, might lose churches, might lose essential businesses. People lost their neighbors. Everybody had something to lose, even if they were among those who were not going to be losing their farm. But keep in mind that not everyone was in sympathy. Most of the letters I saw were in sympathy with farmers. Most of the letters I saw expressed an understanding of how the situation had radically changed in the late 70s and made life terribly difficult for farm families. But not everybody felt like farmers needed help. This person wrote, I don't understand the almost stampede-like atmosphere that exists in trying to bail the farmers out of trouble. There were a number of people who believed that farmers had spent themselves into disaster, that they had signed the loan papers and therefore should take the responsibility. What most of them probably weren't thinking about was the degree to which the situation had changed and the incredible pressure that the high interest rates of the early 1970s put on almost everybody in agriculture. And that unlike other businesses, farmers couldn't raise the price of their corn, of their soybeans, of their cattle, of their hogs in order to make up the money lost in interest payments. There was a letter in the stack that I didn't include in this presentation from a young man who had begun farming in the late 1970s, and he had written into his business plan that he expected to pay $100 a day in interest. And that was with the relatively low interest rates of the 1970s. He wrote in his letter that once his bank had calculated that his interest payment per day was going to be close to $400, that he was going to have to get out of the business. It broke his heart, but he was going to have to get out of the business. Now, the story of the 1980s isn't just a story of farms being lost. It isn't just a story of hard times. It's also a story about people stepping in and trying to help, about organizations and individuals doing what they could to try and improve the situation for farm families. And advocacy groups were very important to this whole attempt to remedy the situation. Probably one of the most important organizations in Iowa was the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, the IFUC, which was an umbrella organization that brought together many, many groups. It brought together small farm crisis committees in individual counties. It brought together the folks in Prairie Fire, those in Catholic Rural Life. It brought together people from the Farmers Union. It was a list of about 15 different organizations that worked together throughout the farm crisis years. These organizations did a number of different things. They ran the first crisis hotline, which was an entirely volunteer hotline that people could call into to ask for help. They also organized food stamp drives. And here is a flyer for one of those drives. There were many farmers who had such low income that they qualified for food stamps, what we call SNAP now. And what the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition wanted to happen was to get as many needy people as possible signed up for food stamps. But they knew that people were deeply embarrassed to do this. So they tried to get everybody to go to these rallies, to go to these food stamp drives, so that the minister would be there, the head of the Kiwanis would be there, that maybe some of the school teachers would also get in line with them. So nobody had to feel embarrassed about applying for food stamps. And these continued throughout the middle of the 1980s. They organized support groups so people could actually find other people with whom to talk about their troubles. They did lobbying both at the state capitol and at the United States Capitol. They connected people to legal aid, to mental health support, to all kinds of other resources. And they also supported other families at farm auctions. They held protests at auctions, trying to convince people not to bid, trying to convince people to pay pennies so that perhaps the farm family could recover what they owned. And there are activities like this going on throughout the decade. Iowa State Cooperative Extension was also very active with the farm crisis. And for those of you who don't know, Extension is the organization at land-grant universities like Iowa State that exists to connect the knowledge of the university to the individual farmer in the field. They're meant to be a bridge, taking information from one place to the other. The traditional role of Extension had been to teach farmers how to raise better pigs, to raise better corn, how to teach farm women how to better can food and better care for their chickens. Those kinds of activities continue in the 1980s, but Extension adds on another layer. They have to help people who are facing extreme economic stress assess their situation. And they also discover that they have to provide mental health aid as well, something they were not trained to do. So there were a number of extension programs. One is called the Farm Aid Program, not the concerts. It was a computer program that helped farmers to run the numbers and to make decisions about their operation. And extension people would literally lug the computer to the home of the farmer and sit down at the table with them in an evening and help them figure things out. They were doing this with 3,500 farm families a year, during the 1980s. And this often turned into a situation where various kinds of mental health support were needed, because they were sometimes having to tell farmers who didn't know it, or who did know it, that their farm was no longer operable, that they were going to probably lose their farm. And they needed to be able to respond to provide mental health help to them, in addition to providing them economic assistance, information about their economic situation. Out of all of this, we also see the creation of the Rural Concern Hotline, which was the official state hotline. There was the volunteer hotline that the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition created first, and then the Rural Concern Hotline that comes in 1984, staffed by people in Extension. And it actually still exists today as the Iowa Concern Hotline. But in the 1980s, it was the Rural Concern Hotline, and they connected people to lawyers. They connected people to mental health providers, to food resources. It was meant to get people the help they needed. Also, late in the decade, they began a new program called Take Charge in Changing Times, which was a program of mental health measures that they took to people, again, in their homes. In the latter part of the decade, at any one moment, there were roughly 550 to 600 people being visited by Extension and provided various kinds of mental health support and decision-making support. A lot of this was done by way of self-help measures. You have here the Stress on the Farm Home Study course. There were a lot of people who were deeply embarrassed that they were depressed and that they were suffering through this really hard time. And they were too embarrassed for their truck to be seen outside of a mental health clinic. And so Extension put a big emphasis on providing people with brochures, providing them with self-help information so that they could help themselves even when they were terribly embarrassed. Extension also acted often as a mediator between the state and other farm groups. And they did the talking sometimes when the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition and the state didn't agree on various issues. Now, the state of Iowa also had a very strong response to the farm crisis. And I've listed first, listening largely without judgment. And I think this is an important part of the government response. When all of those letters went to the governor, someone on the other end responded. And the response, I am happy to say, was a very compassionate one. The governor and his aides would say, "We understand, we don't blame you, this is what we're trying to do." Sometimes they got on the phone and actually connected people with resources, talked to lenders. But most importantly, at the moment when that letter left someone's hand, there was also the knowledge that someone on the other end really was listening. The state provided advocacy with the United States Department of Agriculture, advocacy with the United States government. They had a beginning farmer program, which they began early in the decade, which provided aid to young farmers who wanted to get into the business. Iowa began its first lottery in the 1980s. They used a number of the funds in the early years for interest rate buy-downs to help farmers to be able to pay their loans. They helped to pay for the Rural Concern Hotline. In 1985, Governor Branstad made an emergency declaration, a declaration of economic emergency, which made way for a mortgage foreclosure moratorium. Iowa, since the 1930s, had had on its books that if the governor declared an economic emergency, that there would be a mortgage foreclosure moratorium. It was not a blanket moratorium, but it gave people a set of conditions under which they could apply for a moratorium. And the governor could have done this earlier, but finally decided in 1985 that it was the right moment for this to happen. The state also in 1987 passed a law that required that mediation be offered in the case of the foreclosure of loans of more than $20,000. The farmer didn't have to accept mediation, but they had to be offered the ability to have a mediator come in and perhaps to help them save the property or have their interest bought down or the length of their loan extended. All of these services were used to great effect during the 1980s. But even so, it was a rough decade for the state. The state emerged on the other side battered, bruised, and in a number of ways changed. Agriculture was never again going to be the same. The state would lose almost 25% of its farms, not as many as the 29% that Wisconsin lost, but a very significant number. The Midwestern states were the hardest hit during the 1980s. The state also ended up with larger farms. Big farms got bigger. On the very small farms, men and women often went out to work and brought another source of income in. Middle-sized farmers often lost their operations. Farms over 499 acres grew, but that middle group really lost farms in the 1980s. The farm population also aged. The fastest growing group of farmers in the 1980s were those over the age of 65. The fastest growing relative to the total number. And what that indicated was that lots and lots of young farmers were either losing their farms or simply deciding not to become farmers. Young farmers under the age of 25 had been 5% of Iowa farmers in 1980. By the time we get to 1990, it's only about 2%. Their fathers, who were in the 45 to 55 age range, also lost their farms. And so it's that older group that remains in agriculture, those over 65. And that is why we have what Extension calls today a large number of last generation farmers, farmers who will retire with no family members who want to continue farming. And that is a growing group. And finally, we end up with a changed way of farming. Less diversity of crops, more corn, more soybeans, less animals. The number of animals on farms, particularly hogs and cattle, fell considerably during the 1980s. They were all hit hard by the payment in kind program, which I mentioned earlier. Cattle farmers were hit hard by the federal government's dairy buyout in 1986, where they bought out dairy farmers and then the market was flooded with cattle going to be sold and slaughtered. And so by the time it was all over, the farms that Iowa had were going to look very, very different. It was going to be a state that had changed because of the farm crisis. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions. I hope there's some more things I can tell you about the farm crisis of the 1980s.
Well, thank you, Pam. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I pose our first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions through our Q&A feature. We are on a schedule though, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar, but here's our first question. From whose perspective are you telling this story? And why is it important to understand an issue from all those impacted?
I have tried to take a really holistic view of the farm crisis. I have the voices of people on farms, men, women, Children, I really wanted to have the children there because the children would have been the next generation on the farm, but a lot of them end up deciding that they don't want to go into agriculture as a result of the 80s, or they can't go into agriculture as a result of what happens to their parents' farms. I would say that my book really is about the 2/3 of people who were in trouble. It's not so much about the third who came through the 1980s in relatively good shape. I also deal with the government perspective, the state government perspective, extension, also the advocacy groups. I felt like it was important to get as many voices in there as possible because this really was a statewide event. And it was an event that changed the state. It was an event that shook the state. And so it was important to try and cast my net as broadly as possible when I was working on the project.
A question from the beginning of the talk today, but during the 1970s, were actual farmers selling grain to the Soviet Union, or was it actually grain companies?
Well, what it was it's companies that are selling, but it opened up a market for farmers that hadn't existed before. The grain was being sold, and it's actually usually never individual farmers that are selling to markets. They sell to companies, companies sell it on, but it opened a market that had not existed for them previously, which meant that for a moment, there was much more demand for their grain than there had been in the previous decade.
And forgive me, and with that line of before the 80s, were there any warnings that the farm crisis was looming, and was anyone prepared?
It's interesting. From the point of view of agricultural economists, there's nothing. You would think they would have seen something happening, but really it's just not there. There is, by the end of the 1980s, definitely some activism, particularly by groups like the American Agriculture Movement, that are saying, hey, prices are not keeping up with the costs of production. And organized agricultural groups had been saying that basically since World War II and before, but nobody was prepared for the double whammy of interest rates going through the roof. Nobody saw that. And nobody predicted how that was going to affect the cost of land or the price of land, land values. And so, there were agricultural groups who were saying, hey, the situation isn't great, but nobody saw the policy change coming that was going to hurt farmers so very badly.
And actually, in regards to organizations, the question we have, what was the role of farm organizations during the farm crisis? Were the new farm advocacy groups more helpful than traditional farm organizations?
That's a good question. The traditional farm organizations like the Farm Bureau is also out there lobbying. But when it comes to kind of feet on the ground sorts of events, like getting people signed up for food stamps, creating food pantries, going to protests at auctions, that's largely coming out of the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition. But it's interesting, underneath that umbrella are some older organizations like the Farmers Union, which are also participating and helping with those activities.
Our next question, were there any noticeable differences in how different regions of Iowa experienced the farm crisis? Were some areas of the state harder hit than others?
That is a really interesting question. And I ended up having my mind blown a little bit by what I discovered, because if you look at reductions in the number of farms in various parts of the state and using that as a proxy for hardship over the course of the 20th century, what you see is that if you look at all of the farm losses from 1900 to 2000, the southern tier of the state is the part of the state that in the long run had the largest number of farm losses. So I was expecting that to hold in the 1980s. It didn't. The very southern part of the state actually, in terms of farm losses, suffers less during the 1980s. And I've decided that that was because they had not participated in the same way in the go-go 70s. They were less prosperous to begin with. They didn't spend as much money on new combines and new tractors and buying land. They also had lower valued farms, so they didn't have as much collateral. So they didn't have, they were not jeopardized in the same way as some other farmers were. The worst losses were basically in a, how to explain this, a 2 county-wide column extending north roughly from Polk County up to the border with Minnesota. It's the sort of the I-35 corridor. And those counties had seen the price of land go up really significantly during the 1970s. Those farmers had made a lot of investments, and a lot of those farms were lost. So those were the farms that seemed to have had it the worst. There were also a couple right on the Missouri River that experienced really significant flooding multiple times in the 1980s. And they had large numbers of losses too. But it's mostly that band of counties going right up the middle of the state, which surprised me. It wasn't what I expected at all.
Our next question is about research. Can you talk a bit about the process of culling the letters in the Branstad collection?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't quite hear you.
Yeah, of course. Can you talk a bit about the process of culling the letters in the Branstad collection?
Well, this is where I got lots and lots of help from the people in the State Historical Society. That is an unprocessed collection. There is no finding aid really available for it. What I did was I had some keywords, and with the help of the archivists, we matched those keywords to some very vague box descriptions. And they helped me figure out what boxes I needed. I tried to pull out everything related to agriculture and everything related to constituent letters from 1980. Well, that included the Ray papers as well, but the Branstad ones from 84 to 1990. And I know we missed some just because it's an unprocessed collection. And then it was a matter of sitting there with the letters and flipping through letter after letter, looking for the ones that were specifically related to agriculture. I also found some letters buried in boxes that were in general about agriculture, and I needed to look at those boxes anyway, but there were letters tucked into some of those in odd spots. It involved just lots and lots of help from the wonderful archivists and lots of time spent leafing through letter after letter, looking to find the ones that were going to be useful to me.
In regard to your research, did you have a favorite resource or source or something that really stuck with you?
Oh, wow. A favorite resource or source. The letters were amazing. But my very favorite source was a yearbook that I found for the high school over in Harlan. Part of what I was wanting to do was to tap into how teenagers felt about what was happening around them in the 1980s and to see to what extent they were really aware of what was going on. And a friend of mine, a former student, was working over at the museum in Shelby County. And he handed me, when I went over to visit, a stack of these yearbooks. And 1986 yearbook. And it was called the Something's Missing edition. And I gasped because I thought, oh my, could this be? Could this be? And I opened it up and it was a farm crisis yearbook. Every single page practically included a reflection on what was happening in their community, what was happening to their school, what was happening to their friends. And I managed to track down the woman who was the editor of the yearbook that year and to talk to her about it. And she told me that they had been to the writer's workshop over at the University of Iowa that was done for yearbook editors every year. And they had decided in the course of this experience that they wanted their yearbook to mean something more. They couldn't just write about the football team. That wasn't enough this year. And so they just poured out their hearts about how hard this was to live in a community of 5,000 people where there were 150 houses for sale, where their friends' families were losing their farms, where everybody was talking about graduating and leaving and never coming back. And it was an amazing document that confirmed to me that kids really did care about all of this and helped me to understand a little bit better the kind of heartache that these young people were feeling watching what was happening around them. And I found lots of fantastic stuff while I was working on this project, but that yearbook, I think, was my very favorite source.
Well, our last question, we're close on time, but as a historian, how do you handle researching and studying a topic that is heartbreaking with participants still alive?
Oh, and that is so hard. You try to be sensitive. You try to be careful. For example, when people discussed mental health in their letters, I did not mention them by name. It's difficult, and you have to remember that these are real people and that this happened to them. And for some of them, it may in some ways still be happening for them. And so you just always remember that as you write and as you research.
Well, thank you, Pam. With that answer, we'll bring this webinar to a close. I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch. Thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again, Thursday, October 14th, for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.